war powers under the Constitution, and specifically how President George Washington viewed them. So many people today believe that George Washington set the foundation for unilateral executive war powers that we've lived under for so many decades. And we make the case that this is absolutely absurd if you know what George Washington did, what he said, and how he approached things under the Constitution. So they think that he engaged in war without going to Congress, or they'll tell you, well, he did these things, but he didn't consider it war, so he didn't need to go to Congress. And all of that is absolutely false. And let's kick it off here with this letter from George Washington in 1793. I'm going to cite it again a little bit later. He says, "The Constitution vests the power of declaring war with Congress." Now, keep in mind, some of these same people want you to believe that the power to declare war is limited to Congress just issuing a document. They have no say over anything else. But there is not a single person, anti-federalist or federalist, that they can cite at the founding that believed that to be the case. Instead, everyone, even Hamilton, believed that the power to declare war was the power to change the state of things from peace to war. Even if another nation declared war first, it was still up to Congress. Because if you think about it, not in any situation, you may not always want to go to war. And they wanted to have a scenario where it wasn't in the hands of a single dude to make this decision, because maybe you want to have a war with the people on your southern border, for example. This is something that we'll address here in a little bit in 1793. But George Washington actually said, well, maybe we don't want to do that because it might draw a European ally and create a wider war. So it really was up to the representatives of the people and the representatives of the states, at least how it was at that point, to make this decision, even in response to another nation declaring war. So the Constitution vests that power with Congress, according to President Washington. Now, he did follow up on this, and it sounds like he included a big caveat. So he said, therefore, no offensive expedition of importance can be undertaken until after Congress shall have deliberated upon the subject and authorized such a measure. So most people, when they hear this, because they have confirmation bias, they just want to believe that George Washington didn't follow the Constitution as, well, the Constitution was approved, and therefore, well, or the Constitution wasn't approved in the way that we're telling you, that only Congress can make this decision. They say, well, oh, see, look, he set the stage. He can do these offensive measures. As long as it's not a big deal, maybe small raids and things like that, we're all okay. But they don't know the context of what this was about, when it was said, or anything of the sort. They don't know that George Washington made this statement even after he was aware that another nation had declared war on the United States. So after the other nation had declared war, he's still saying we can't do any offensive measures of importance, basically very close to a completely strict defensive line in the sand until Congress specifically authorized more. Now, before we get into the details of how this played out in the 1790s, let's go back to George Washington's recommendations, his sentiments on a peace establishment, May of 1783, as the war for independence is winding down, months before the Treaty of Paris is completed. He said, first, a regular and standing force. He wanted a standing army, but very small. A regular and standing force for garrisoning West Point and such other posts upon our northern, western, and southern frontiers, as shall be deemed necessary to awe the Indians, protect our trade, prevent the encroachment of our neighbors of Canada and the Floridas, and guard us at least from surprises. So really a defensive posture to protect trade and guard the frontier. He said, secondly, a well-organized militia upon a plan that will pervade all the states and introduce similarity to their establishment, maneuvers, exercise, and arms. Of course, Washington agreed with his first Secretary of War in 1790 that the capital security of a free country ought to be in the militia, not a large standing army. But he did actually approve, Washington certainly did approve a small force on the frontier. And that's exactly what the Continental or the Confederation Congress, this is Continental Congress, in 1784 gave him, creating the peace establishment there in June 3rd of 1784. Here's how it reads. Whereas a body of troops to consist of 700 non-commissioned officers and privates, 700, that's it, properly officered, are immediately in and indispensably necessary for taking possession of the western posts as soon as evacuated by the troops of His Britannic Majesty for the protection of the northwestern frontiers and for guarding the public stores. So they authorized 700 officers and privates. That's it. Now, there was some conflict that was going down because a lot of the territory on the frontier was disputed between the Indian nations and the United States. And by 1786, I believe it was, the Confederation Congress passed another resolution to expand that number of troops to potentially as many as 2,000. In the meantime, Secretary of War Henry Knox, he was, I think, the second one at that point, and then he was the first under the Constitution. He sent a report to Congress saying, well, there are some issues. Maybe some of the states, the people of the United States, are causing some problems on the frontier. And here's a report, a committee report of February 20th, 1787, talking about what Knox told them. Certain encroachments are made on the lands of the Creek and Cherokee nations by the people of Georgia and North Carolina. It's causing trouble. So they decided they wanted to kind of chill out and try to calm things down. They said, there is a reason to apprehend the Creek Indians are meditating a serious blow against the inhabitants of Georgia, and proposes that it be recommended to that state to use every possible means to preserve peace between her citizens and those Indians, and that Congress resolve they are bound to draw forth a sufficient number of the forces of the Union to punish any nation or tribe of Indians that shall attempt to make war on either the United States, but on either of the United States, so any member of the United States, by attacking or killing any of their citizens. So that was in February of 1787. And then Congress in July of 1787 passed another resolution to authorize these troops. And I think it was 700 again. So this is July 21st, 1787. Resolved that the Secretary at War place the troops of the United States in such positions as shall afford the most effectual protection to the frontier inhabitants of Pennsylvania and Virginia from the incursions and depredations of the Indians, for preventing intrusions on the federal lands and promoting a favorable issue to the intended treaty. So they wanted to have a treaty of peace, but they recognized that if there were incursions and there was violence, whoever was starting it, they had to have some peacekeepers, we'll say. And also resolved that the executive of Virginia be requested to give orders to the militia in the District of Kentucky to hold themselves in readiness to unite with federal troops in such operations as the officer commanding them may judge necessary for the protection of the frontiers. And on the application of the commanding officer of the federal troops, the said executive be requested to give orders that a part of the said militia not exceeding 1,000, etc., basically authorizing them to make expeditions against the Indians, quote, in case they continue hostile, as Congress shall hereafter order and direct. So we get a couple of points out of this resolution in July of 1787. First of all, Congress made it very explicit that the army and the militia might need to take offensive measures, what they called expeditions, to stop the attacks. And they authorized this. Two, Congress then retained ultimate control over what was going to go down, because Congress shall hereafter order and direct. Three, and Congress then said it would basically their decision was going to turn on whether or not the Indian nations remained hostile. And they also, four, seemed to acknowledge that the federal army already had this authority to launch operations. So they're saying, look, we're defending this. We've already authorized you to defend this. Here's what we really want to have happen going forward. And then on October 3rd of 1787, we get another resolution of the Continental Congress to renew the peace establishment. Resolved that the interests of the United States require that a corps of 700 troops, again, not a huge force, should be stationed on the frontiers to protect the settlers of the public lands from the depredations of the Indians, and they would be raised for a term of 3 years, October of 1787. We're getting to the point where we're going through the ratification debates. So by the time the Constitution was actually ratified, there was already some conflict happening. There was already actions being authorized, primarily in defense, but some offensive expeditions. But by the time the Constitution was in effect, these didn't have any legal force anymore. I'll get to that in just a moment. But once George Washington was president under the new Constitution, he started pushing Congress to act. Here he is on August 7th, 1789. This is a message delivered by Henry Knox, the Secretary of War. It says, "The disputes which exist between some of the United States and several powerful tribes of Indians within the limits of the Union, and the hostilities which have in several instances been committed on the frontiers, seem to require the immediate interposition of the general government." If you think about this, October of 1787, they authorized 700 troops for 3 years. Well, that Congress didn't exist anymore. It was a new Congress under the Constitution, and that 3 years was going to wind down pretty soon in October of 1790. They didn't act based on this message, so Washington made it clear that this was a big priority for him to deal with this. And he sent another message just 3 days later, and this is to the Senate. "These troops were raised by virtue of the resolves of Congress on October 20th, 1786, going back to those resolutions, and the 3rd of October, 1787, the one that I was reading some parts to you just a few minutes ago, in order to protect the frontiers from the depredations of the hostile Indians, to prevent all intrusions on the public lands, and to facilitate the surveying and selling of the same for the purpose of reducing the public debt." And that is August 10th, 1789. Now, meanwhile, Major General Arthur St. Clair, this was the governor of the Northwest Territory. Now, there was certainly some dispute over whether that was valid because a lot of the Indian nations didn't recognize the boundaries of that Northwest Territory, and that caused some conflict. But he sent a letter in September of 1789 to President Washington talking about this. He said, and this is the really important part, "By a resolution of the late Congress," we're talking about how the resolutions of the previous Congress under the Articles of Confederation authorized some military action if needed, primarily in defense, maybe some expeditions that could go beyond that. "By a resolution of the late Congress, the governor of the Western Territory had power, in case of hostilities, to call upon Virginia and Pennsylvania for a number of men to act in conjunction with the Continental troops and carry war into the Indian settlement." So they recognize that the Continental Congress authorized them to raise the troops and wage and engage in warfare in certain situations. But he says that resolution, it is now supposed, is no longer in force. By 1789, the Continental Congress is over, and they're under a whole new system of government. So that didn't hold any legal force anymore, is how he's saying it. The revival of it might be of use, as it would tend to conciliate the Western people by showing them that they were not unattended to, and would in some measure justify me in holding a language to the Indians which might obviate the necessity of employing force against them. He wants to be able to tell the people who live there, and he wants to be able to tell the Indian nations, look, they just reauthorized this, and I can call up the militia to go after you. And he's actually asking for that power. He's asking about being able to carry war and, quote, act offensively. That was September 14th, 1789. So George Washington turns around 2 days later and sends a letter to the House and the Senate in Congress. And he says, "I think proper to suggest to your consideration the expediency of making some temporary provision for calling forth the militia of the United States for the purposes stated in the Constitution, which would embrace the cases apprehended by the governor of the Western Territory." So he's pointing out to him, look, Governor Arthur St. Clair is concerned about what's going on. He needs the authority to be able to take action in response. We don't have that legal authority anymore. We have to do this and conform to the Constitution of the United States. I'm asking you to do this. This is September 16th, 1789. Now, finally, after some prodding and pushing and asking multiple times, Congress passed the act, September 29th, an act for the establishment of troops that officially established the Army under the Constitution in that first year. And it also authorized the president to call up the militia to deal with potential Indian wars. The full title of it says a lot: an act to recognize and adapt to the Constitution of the United States, the establishment of the troops raised under the resolves of the United States and Congress assembled, and for other purposes. So they're all recognizing that there was an authorization to raise troops, to use them as needed to defend the frontier, that it had expired, and they needed to reauthorize it under the Constitution for the United States. Here's what it said: for the purpose of protecting the inhabitants of the frontiers of the United States from the hostile incursions of the Indians, the president is hereby authorized to call into service from time to time such part of the militia of the states, respectively, as he may judge necessary for the purpose aforesaid, and that their pay and subsistence while in service be the same as the pay and subsistence of the troops above mentioned. So they're establishing the Army under the Constitution, and then they're also authorizing him to use military force for dealing with hostile incursions of the Indians and calling forth the militia for it. You'd think he could just do that on its own, but here he is going to Congress and asking for their permission in September of 1789. So he follows this. Now he gets the approval. So he writes to Governor St. Clair, October 6, 1789. He says, Congress, having by their act of the 29th of September last, empowered me to call forth the militia. So up until September 29, 1789, George Washington did not believe that, even though it was spelled out in the Constitution, he did not believe he was authorized to call forth the militia to respond to Indian incursions, attacks, reprisals, self-defense, however you describe it. Couldn't deal with violence in the frontier until he was authorized by Congress to do so. Congress, having by their act of the 29th of September last, empowered me to call forth the militia of the states respectively for the protection of the frontiers from the incursions of the hostile Indians. I have thought proper to make this communication to you together with the instructions herein contained. And he sent some instructions specifically to a couple of the governors and basically says, I would have it observed forcibly that a war with the Wabash Indians ought to be avoided by all means consistently with the security of the frontier inhabitants. So avoid war as long as you can keep it safe, but do not go out there looking for war. He's saying focus on peace first. He said the security of the troops and the national dignity. So you have to be consistent with the security of the frontier residents, the inhabitants, the security of the troops, and national dignity. That was a big deal for George Washington, this dignity thing. He says, but if after manifesting clearly to the Indians the disposition of the general government for the preservation of peace and the extension of a just protection to the said Indians, they should continue their incursions, the United States will be constrained to punish them with severity. So he's saying, look, offer them a deal, stay at peace, tell them you'll even protect them and keep things at peace. You want to trade. That's, of course, George Washington's policy. But if after this they keep attacking, they keep doing these incursions, and of course, other people can debate over who is doing incursions, who is on the offense, who is attacking, who is defensive. But for him, under the Constitution, he's basically saying, look, only after we go through all these efforts can you actually go out there and punish them with severity. So then they passed an act that was the one in September of 1789. And mind you, the important part is that was just a stopgap authorizing him to do that. They said it was going to expire at the end of the session. So it had a sunset. So in 1790, they passed another 3 full year authorization. It says that for the purpose of aiding the troops now in service or to be raised by this act, in protecting the inhabitants of the frontiers of the United States, the president is hereby authorized to call into service from time to time such part of the militia of the states, respectively, as he may judge necessary for that purpose. Again, they just formalized it. They gave him a 3-year authorization to do that. And it was only after this authorization from Congress that President Washington ended up authorizing a larger offensive campaign, which is now known as the Harmar campaign. It was a pretty big failure. That's, if you want to read about that, that's a whole nother thing. But certainly this was his approach. He had to keep going to Congress to ask for approval. When they didn't give it to him, he kept asking. He really pressed him. He provided him information from the governor on the frontier to say, look, he's asking us. He needs our help. And then they gave it to him temporarily. And then they followed up. That was April 30th, 1790, for a 3-year authorization. Now, this was no isolated incident of how George Washington dealt with war powers. Here's Governor William Blount from Tennessee in a letter, I think it was the Tennessee Territory at that time, in a letter to Henry Knox, September of 1792, he points out, well, there was a war declared on the United States by the Cherokees. This is a letter of September 26, 1792. He says, letters from the Little Turkey, chief of the Cherokees, the Boot, and the 2 interpreters of the United States, James Carey and somebody Thompson, inform us that the 5 lower towns of the Cherokees have declared war on against the United States. So there was a declaration of war by the Cherokee Nation, or at least 5 towns of the Cherokees declared war against the United States. And here's another letter from the governor to Henry Knox, September 11th, 1792. And I think this one really strikes me a lot. That's why I wanted to include this. There's so many other documents. I'm trying to keep it as narrow and focused as possible to show you how George Washington viewed war powers, and it's so far different than what anyone does today. But this is the governor to Henry Knox a couple of weeks later. He said, this declaration of war was very unexpected and has given great alarm to the frontiers indeed. I do not find that anything of the kind has ever before been done by the Indians in so formal a manner. So there was a formal and official declaration of war. We know that, like for the Barbary pirates, the way they declared war, their custom was to chop down your flag. And I believe in many of the Indian nations, it would either be a scalp or a beheading of somebody. So it depends on where you were coming from and what was the tradition to say, we are now officially at war. But he's saying here, the governor's telling the Secretary of War, this was a very formal declaration. It is very obvious they are going to go to war with us. They have already declared war on September 11th, 1792. That was the Cherokee. So Henry Knox writes to George Washington, and he tells him about this. This is October 9th, less than a month later, October 9th, 1792. And he had a meeting with the cabinet, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of the Treasury. Who were those people? Well, Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State. Secretary of the Treasury was Alexander Hamilton, usually opposite ends of the spectrum. Hamilton, some years later, even though he took this particular position here in 1792, he took an opposite position in 1801. We'll talk about that in another episode. But here, Henry Knox says, I have consulted with the Secretary of State and the Secretary of the Treasury on this disagreeable affair. What is going on in Tennessee? The war that was declared by the Cherokee on the United States, officially declared war. He said, our unanimous opinion is that as Governor Blount has been furnished heretofore with the most ample powers to draw for the militia of his government for its defensive protection, that all measures of an offensive nature be restrained until the meeting of Congress, to whom belong the powers of war. So even though war has been declared by another nation on the United States, and even though that other nation attacks, the response can only be the line of defense. You can't go hunt them down and start burning down their cities or taking all these prisoners because you are not at war. And maybe Congress has decided that they wanted to take a different approach. Now, maybe you agree with how Congress deals with stuff. Maybe you don't. But that's how the founders separated the powers. James Madison said this is the wisest part of the Constitution, of leaving this decision in the hands of the legislature and not in the hands of the executive, because all history has informed us that the executive is the branch most interested and most prone to war. So that's the way you're going to get the most of it. So he's sending this letter to George Washington. He says it's a unanimous decision that even though they've declared war, even if they attack us, Henry Knox, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton all agreed that it would have to go to Congress to authorize offensive measures. He sends another letter to Governor William Blount. I might be Blount. I apologize for those of you. We got so many supporters in Tennessee. I love you guys. I really suck at some of these names because I get them through reading, so I will take corrections all day long on this stuff. I learned how to say James Iredell's name a couple of years ago from a person in the comments on a live stream, so I appreciate your input. So the governor of Tennessee, Henry Knox, sends a letter the same day. I'm not sure which one went first, which one went second, but he points out that, well, here, as you have ample powers to call forth such portions of the militia of your government for its defensive protection as you shall judge occasions to require, no further steps can be taken at this moment. Henry Knox, Secretary of War, is saying, even under attack, nothing beyond defense can be taken at this moment. He said the Congress, which possess the powers of declaring war, will assemble on the 5th of next month. Until their judgments shall be made known, it seems essential to confine all your operations to defensive measures. This is intended to restrain any expedition against the Indian towns. Expedition, again, being an offensive measure. We know that they had previously authorized expeditions. Now, when they're reauthorizing stuff, here we are in the 1790s, this had not been authorized. Congress has not authorized expeditions against the Indian towns. But all incursive parties, said Henry Knox, against your frontiers are to be punished with the greatest severity. So if they cross the border and they are incursion and they're attacking and they're violent, go nuts. Greatest severity of punishment. But you cannot cross the line and do anything offensive. So even though the Cherokee Nation had, or 5 towns, we'll just say the Cherokee Nation had officially and very formally, like none before it ever seen by the Indian nations, declared war against the United States. Knox and the entire cabinet, Jefferson and Hamilton, and then also Washington, because he told Knox, well, here's the orders. They all did not think that they could unilaterally take offensive actions without approval from Congress. So Washington then included more messages from the governor of Tennessee about the Cherokee declaring war in a special message to the House and Senate. This is December 7th, 1792. All this stuff will be linked to in the show notes. Alan Mosley from Tennessee. I'm sorry if I'm doxing you, Alan, but I really appreciate all the great work that Alan's been doing for quite some time now to organize all the blog posts for every episode with all the links, the reference links, so you can read all the stuff that I mentioned here, just scratching the surface in context on your own time. He'll also include links to all the various platforms, both video and audio-only podcast versions. That'll be over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I'll get it published a couple of hours after this live stream is done here this morning or afternoon or whenever you happen to be listening or watching. So December 7th, 1792, George Washington has a special message to the gentlemen of the Senate and of the House of Representatives. And he's basically saying there's this letter from the 9th of October, which has been already communicated to you from the same department to the governor, will show in what manner the first section of the act of last session, which provides for calling out the militia for the repelling of Indian invasions, has been executed. So we know how this thing has been played out. You authorized to do this. You authorized us to call forth the militia. The governor has the power to call forth the militia to repel this invasion, if there is any. Henry Knox told him, and under my orders, you can only do this, but line in the sand, offensive measures do not count. He says it remains to be considered by Congress whether in the present situation of the United States it be advisable or not to pursue any further or other measures than those which have been already adopted. The nature of the subject does of itself call for your immediate attention to it, and I must add that upon the result of your deliberation, the future conduct of the executive will on this occasion materially depend. In other words, I can't do anything else other than what we've been doing until you give me permission to do more. I'm asking you, really, this is a way that he's asking how to do this. This was December 7th, 1792. Now, in May of 1793, by that point, Congress did not give him the approval. They did not say you can take offensive measures. They did not declare war, full-scale war. They didn't even limit it to anything. They just didn't do it. Now, Henry Knox wasn't happy. He wanted them to do this. It looked like George Washington wanted it as well. And here's how this is a letter to Governor Henry Lee, I believe. George Washington to Governor Henry Lee in Virginia. He says, "It gives me inexpressible pain to receive such frequent and distressing accounts from the western frontiers of this Union occasioned by Indian hostilities, more especially as our hands are tied to defensive measures." Again, even under attack, even in a scenario where the attackers have declared war, Washington is telling Governor Lee in Virginia, stay on the defense only. You can't cross the line. Henry Knox had the same kind of message to the governor of Tennessee, Governor Blount. He said, "It is indeed a serious question to plunge the nation into a war with the southern tribes of Indians, supported as it is said they would be." So they were concerned that on the southern frontier, that a European ally might come to their defense. And so therefore, that is part of why you leave this decision, even when under attack, to the representatives of the people and the representatives of the states. It's not up to one person, because maybe they want to try something else. That's the whole point of it. But he's saying, like, look, it's a very serious situation. He says, but if that war actually exists, if depredations are repeated and continued upon the frontier inhabitants, the measure of protection is indispensable. But that protection can only be of the defensive sort. Again, Secretary of War Henry Knox. Not... I mean, can you think of the so-called secretaries of defense that we've lived under our entire lives ever taking a position like this? Nowhere close. He says, if other or more, man, I am all over the place with my cursor. If other or more extensive measures shall be necessary, they must probably result from the authority expressly given for that purpose. In other words, it had to be from Congress. Now, the Tennessee governor kept pushing. He kept sending letters. I need the authority to go on the offense. And he just wouldn't do it, but he kept pushing. It was almost like he was a bit pesky at this point. And in response, Henry Knox sends a letter back to him in July of 1794. Mind you, all this time they keep asking, and Congress they're not even saying no. They're just not acting on it. They're choosing to not do anything. Maybe it was a wise choice because they were concerned of a broader war that they weren't capable of, or maybe they were just incompetent. Who knows? We can't make that decision. I mean, that's all opinion. But ultimately, the decision's with Congress, and they chose not to make that decision. So Knox sends another letter to Governor Blount, and he says, I am instructed especially by the president. So he's saying, look, I know you've been asking me over and over about this. You're telling me about all this horrible stuff. We agree it's bad. We asked for authorization from Congress. Congress didn't give it to us. But you know what? You can pester me all you want, but this is ultimately, George Washington told me to tell you this. I am instructed especially by the president to say that he does not consider himself authorized to direct any such measure, more especially as the whole subject was laid before Congress in the last session, who did not think it proper to authorize or direct offensive operations. He's like, dude, tell your boy in Tennessee, chill out. We are asking, we are with him, but our hands are tied. We cannot go any further without Congress authorizing it. Now, George Washington took the same approach against the Creek Nation, the Creeks, I believe, which had been doing some attacks against the United States, or maybe defensive measures against the United States, depending on how you look at it, starting in April of 1793. And here he is in a letter to South Carolina Governor William Moultrie. Again, I'm not sure if I got the word pronounced right, but the name pronounced right, so let me know in the chat if I got that right or wrong. But he wrote to the governor of South Carolina with his view that he hoped to launch, quote, an offensive expedition against the refractory part of the Creek Nation, whenever Congress should decide that measure to be proper and necessary. Again, always got to wait on Congress. He said, the Constitution vests the power, and you're going to recognize this quote from the beginning, the Constitution vests the power of declaring war with Congress. Therefore, no offensive expedition of importance can be undertaken until after they shall have deliberated upon the subject and authorized such a measure. So he's telling the governor of South Carolina, like, okay, we've got some problems with the Creek Nation. They are already on the attack. They didn't have the same type of a formal declaration of war as the Cherokee. And I haven't actually researched if they had a specific process, but there certainly was war being waged by the Creeks against places like South Carolina, etc. So again, no offensive expedition of importance. And indeed, this is already after the Creek had started waging war against the United States. And from my understanding, this was their version of a declaration of war. I have to study this a little bit further. But again, changing the state of things from peace to war. They have already made that decision. It was just a question of whether or not these United States would make the same decision in response. And here's Washington again in his 5th annual message to Congress discussing this. This is December 3rd, 1793. And he says, an anxiety has been also demonstrated by the executive for peace with the Creeks and the Cherokees. The former have been relieved with corn and with clothing, and offensive measures against them prohibited during the recess of Congress. If Congress isn't around, I can't do anything. I got to wait for your approval. He says, to satisfy the complaints of the latter, prosecutions have been instituted for the violences committed upon them. But he's also recognizing that there were people doing bad stuff to the Indian nations, and they were already doing prosecutions to try to slow that down because they were creating their own problem in some ways. He said, but the papers which will be delivered to you disclose the critical footing on which we stand in regard to both those tribes, and it is with Congress to pronounce what shall be done. So George Washington was not taking the position that, oh, we're under attack. It's up to my own choosing of when, where, and how we will respond. No. Line of defense, very, very clear. And anything offensive, go to Congress, please. And if Congress doesn't do anything, he's basically in a position of asking for permission over and over and over. Now, of course, some people tell us in response to this kind of information, oh, George Washington did all this, but that wasn't really a war. It didn't count as a war. No one thought it was a war. So it doesn't really implicate the declare war clause. And, he can do what he wants if he wants to. But here in a letter to Timothy Pickering, this is in March of 1795, he disagreed with that as well. There are other examples of how the war with the Creeks and the Cherokee were repeatedly described as a war, not just some kind of police action or whatever garbage they use today to claim that they don't have to declare war as required by the Constitution. Here he is referring to it to Timothy Pickering as the predatory war between the Southern Indians and the southern and southwestern frontiers of these United States. And then on top of it, there were treaties, both with the Cherokee in 1794 and with the Creeks in 1796. Here's the one in 1794 that specifically make it clear that they were previously at war and reestablishing peace. That's how they put it in the treaty with the Cherokee. He said reestablishing peace and friendship between the said parties in a permanent manner. That was the point of the treaty. They were reestablishing peace because they were not at peace. They were at war. Everyone understood this was a war, and therefore it required the declaration of war or some version of it, either a formal declaration of war or some kind of authorization, because other than that, the president had to stay on the line of defense, and so did the governors as well. And same with the treaty with the Creeks in June of 1796. They wanted to remove the causes of the war as well. And this is, again, more evidence that what all the supporters of the monster state, supporters of unilateral executive war powers are just full of it. Either they're totally lying and hoping you're ignorant, or they're ignorant, or maybe some kind of combination of all the above. Now, to sum it up, George Washington understood war powers like this. Congress makes the decision if the nation will go to war. And you can fend off of it an attack or repel an actual invasion, but that does not implicate the declare war power clause. And so that's why he kept giving these commands to stick to defensive measures only, just very straightforward. And he repeatedly went to Congress for approval to go on the offense, and only went on the offense when they did give him the approval. Now, on top of that, and I think it's important to reiterate that Washington and his entire cabinet took the position that Congress still would be the one to decide if there were going to be offensive measures, a declaration of war, even after another nation had declared war and had been attacking over and over and over. This is George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Henry Knox, and Alexander Hamilton. All were unanimous in taking that position. Now, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. There's a lot of information in this one, but I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. If you want to help us reach and teach more and more people about this essential kind of history, plus the original legal meaning of the Constitution and how to defend it when government refuses to do so, which is constantly, nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month. Throw some of that dirty government fiat that they've been using to prop up the empire. Throw it our way. $2 a month. We will use it to punch above our weight class and take a stand for the Constitution and liberty, whether they like it or not. And they absolutely don't. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. I am going to skip going over the live chat today. I don't often do that on Fridays. Anyway, don't actually check the chat too often on Fridays, but I'm definitely going much longer on this episode. I really, really appreciate you watching or listening. I hope you have a great weekend, and I hope to see you next week here on the path to liberty.